Halloween night started out quiet. My parents had just left for a school party with my little brother, leaving me home alone to unwind. I'd had my fill of horror that day. 2 tests, 3 essays. A night watching scary movies was enough. After setting a candy bowl on the porch, I scrolled through the horror channels until I found the Not So Good Dead. I pressed play, though I couldn't shake a bad feeling. Halloween never sat right with me, not since last year, when 5 teenagers and an entire family went missing. The only body found was hardly recognizable, a headless, gutted teenager. People chalked it up to a bear or wolf attack, but somehow I wasn't convinced. The grandfather clock struck 9, and it hit me that my family should have been home by now. The thought rattled me, and I went for my phone. Then came a knock on the door. I froze. At that hour, no one should be knocking. My parents had keys, so why would they knock? Brushed it off, assuming it was a prank, until the knocks came again, louder this time. Heart pounding. I dialed my dad's number, but before I could press call, the knocks turned to pounding. Heavy, rapid, and relentless. I pressed the call button, but there was no service. Then silence. I glanced at the door, and there, staring back through the mail slot, was a single glassy white eye. It locked onto mine, then slid shut with a loud clank, echoing through the house. I stayed frozen, listening to footsteps fading into the distance, but something told me it wasn't over. And then the power cut. Darkness swallowed the room, and I held my breath, sinking to the floor to stay hidden. Time seemed to stretch, every second a quiet agony. I forced myself to stand, whispering, "Who's there?" Instantly regretting it. Footsteps charged back to the door, followed by violent scratching and banging, something desperate and furious. I took a step back, and then it let out a screech, inhuman, a cross between a bat and a dying animal. The door started to bend and crack, and then with one final blow it broke off its hinges, crashing to the floor. I stumbled back into the kitchen, grabbed a knife from the drying rack, and turned, bracing myself. But the doorway was empty. Just the broken door framing a thick fog outside. No light, no houses, just an endless gray mist swallowing everything. Above me, claws scraped across the ceiling, each drag sending shivers through my spine. I didn't dare look up. But then, it dropped down in front of me, a creature, with rotting flesh slipping off bone, arms so long they scraped the floor. The stench of death filled the room. It wasn't even looking at me. Its gaze was fixed upward, almost joyful as it admired the claw marks it had left. Then it made a noise, a whine, almost animal-like, but wrong in every way. My foot hit a creaky floorboard and its head snapped toward me. Panicked, I stumbled back, falling to the floor. I looked up and locked eyes with it. The skin on its skull hung loose, veins dark and pulsing underneath. I retched from the sight and smell, and the creature let out a low, hyena-like cackle, mocking my fear. Before I could recover, it lunged, backhanding me with a force that sent me flying across the kitchen. Pain shot through my arm. I was sure it was broken. Desperate, I grabbed the knife with my good hand, holding it out as the creature stalked closer, savoring my fear. I closed my eyes, ready for the end. I could hear it sniffing the air, catching a scent that made it salivate. Then, as if hypnotized, it turned to the cabinet, ripped the door off, and pulled out an old bag of candy corn. It held the bag with almost reverence, then started toward the door. Before it left, it paused, squatting down to play in the mess I'd made when I was sick. It poked through the puddle, picked out a piece of chocolate, looked right at me, and in a guttural mimic of my own voice sneered, "Bad candy." Then, without another glance, it disappeared into the fog. The house shook violently as it left, and the fog outside thinned, revealing the empty street. My legs gave out, and I collapsed. As my eyes started to close, I heard distant screams. My neighbor's. He was begging, pleading for his life, but then, only wet, tearing sounds filled the silence. I blacked out. When I came to, my dad was leaning over me, tears in his eyes. I was bandaged up in a hospital bed and my family looked shaken. I told them it had been a robbery. I knew no one would believe what I'd actually seen. A few weeks later, they found my neighbor's body, or what was left of it. His organs had been replaced with candy corn, and every night since I've had nightmares, haunted by that sound, bad candy. Halloween night, and I was alone in an empty house that used to echo with my children's laughter. It was my ex's turn to take Lily and Ben trick-or-treating, a custody detail I'd had to get used to since the divorce. Still, I couldn't help but hope they'd stop by, eager to show off their costumes and bags of candy. When the doorbell rang, I felt a flicker of hope. But when I opened the door, there was only the dark, empty porch and the cold October wind. Just a prank, I told myself, closing the door. But then it rang again and again. Each time I opened the door to find nothing, my hope shifted to worry, then fear. By midnight, I was desperate. My ex hadn't called, the kids hadn't stopped by, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was horribly wrong. The next day, fear turned to panic as the town buzzed with reports of missing children. My heart stopped as the news anchor read their names, but Lily and Ben weren't on the list. I tried calling them, calling my ex, nothing but voicemail. My mind raced with images of the empty door frame from the night before, each unanswered ring echoing in my ears like a warning I hadn't understood. I drove to my ex's house, heart pounding, only to find it dark and silent. I pounded on the door, calling out for them, but my voice vanished into the stillness. Desperation took over. I broke down the door and searched every room, each more silent than the last. The kids' beds were untouched, as if they'd never even come home. The chill of realization washed over me, leaving me hollow. They were gone, and I'd missed the signs. All I could think about was the doorbell. Had they been trying to reach me? Why couldn't I see them? A terrible guilt and helplessness ate at me, a horror deeper than anything I'd ever known. I called the police, reported them missing, and waited in that house, my body tense, mind reeling. And then, as the sun began to set, the doorbell rang again. This time I couldn't bring myself to open it. Days turned to weeks. The police had no leads and whispers spread through town. People looked at me with suspicion, their fear transforming into accusations. Words like suspect and guilty circled me like vultures, but I couldn't care. I was being eaten alive from the inside, hollowed out by fear and guilt. My children were out there somewhere, and I'd failed them. Then, one late night, as I sat staring at old photos of Lily and Ben, the doorbell rang again, splitting the silence. Dread pooled in my stomach, but I had to answer. This time, there was something on the doorstep, a small plastic bag. Inside, I found two things, a worn teddy bear that belonged to Lily and a superhero mask, Ben's favorite. Holding those familiar objects, my heart shattered. They weren't just toys. They were a cruel reminder of what I'd lost, of the horror I was living. The doorbell became my tormentor, ringing at random, keeping me in a state of fear and dread. Each ring tore at me, twisting the knife of loss deeper. I'd fling open the door, praying against all logic that I'd see Lily and Ben. But the porch was always empty, the street as silent as my home. Then, the police brought me more bad news. My ex's car had been found abandoned on a desolate road, no sign of her or the kids. It was as though they'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but those haunting reminders. And as the weeks slipped by, I was left with nothing but the endless, suffocating silence. The once joyful sound of the doorbell now filled me with dread, a cruel echo of what my life had become.
October crept up on me once again, bringing with it the familiar last-minute scramble to embrace Halloween spirit. I usually manage with a hastily written story or a silly game, but this year, I didn't have to go looking for horror. It found me. It all began with a call about my grandfather's passing. My family, Southern to the core, was down in Louisiana, far from where I'd grown up in Connecticut. Visits were rare, and I hadn't known my grandfather well. Still, the idea of reconnecting with family felt strangely comforting, even if it was under such grim circumstances. I left college in New York, figuring my professors would understand the absence. My sister and I stayed with our mom in Connecticut before heading to Louisiana. We carved pumpkins, watched horror movies, the familiar comforts of fall. But soon, we were boarding a plane south, where everything felt foreign and steeped in old traditions. Lafayette was crowded, the usual hotels booked up for some local event, so we ended up at an old inn, weathered and forgotten by time. Inside, the flicker of candlelight cast strange shadows over animal skins and relics from another era. An elderly hostess welcomed us, her gaze kind but solemn as she offered complimentary treats and drinks. When my mother explained the reason for our visit, the woman's face fell. "I'm so sorry, my lovelies. Just, please stay away from the swamps." Her voice was earnest and something about her warning lingered. I knew I should heed it, but curiosity tugged at me. Ignoring her caution would prove to be a grave mistake. Our rooms were cozy, each with a single bed. Mom tucked us in, just like she used to when we were little. "We'll get through this together," she said, her voice heavy. I snapped at her to stop babying us, brushing off her affection as if I'd have endless chances to make it up to her. But I never would. That was the last time I saw her. In the early hours of the morning, I woke my sister, my heart pounding with an idea. "Let's go explore the swamps," I whispered. She hesitated, but with a little coaxing, she agreed, swept up by the excitement of a spooky Halloween adventure. Outside, the mist wrapped around us as we walked past the edge of town, the eerie quiet pressing in. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the ground turned soft and treacherous, and a rancid swamp smell filled the air. I brushed off the growing sense of unease and ignored the rustling sounds I assumed were just animals. But when we hit the mud, thick and suffocating, the feeling grew. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and every sound became sharper, more menacing. "Let's turn back," I urged, the fear clawing its way up my spine. My sister nodded, and we started back, each step quicker than the last. But as we turned, something snapped. There was a blur of motion, leaves and mud flying, and suddenly, we were hoisted into the air, tangled together in a net. Panic set in. I heard footsteps and then a low, sinister laugh. A sharp pain struck my head, and everything went black. When I woke, it was to a stench that turned my stomach, an overwhelming mix of rot, waste, and death. The dim light revealed a filthy, overcrowded room with barely enough space to move. I was stripped of my clothes, surrounded by emaciated, defeated people with hollow eyes and blank faces. There was no anger, only despair. The floor was slick with unspeakable filth, littered with bones and bits of flesh. Some of the others huddled around, gnawing on severed limbs. Before I could make sense of my surroundings, a boot slammed into my side. I crumpled to the ground in agony as cruel laughter filled the room. "This one thinks he's tough," a voice sneered. Rage flared up inside me, and I managed to push back, shouting, "Where is my sister?" My defiance was met with more laughter. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough," he said, an unsettling gleam in his eye. They dragged me into a dark room stained with dried blood and littered with organs. A man stood waiting, his face obscured by a burlap sack. He tortured me relentlessly, every blow and every taunt designed to break me. They deprived me of sleep, fed me nothing but a metallic, coppery liquid that I could only hope wasn't blood. After what felt like days, they finally let me go, chuckling as they shoved me back into the crowded room. I understood now why everyone else looked so broken. Their spirits had been hollowed out by this nightmare. I don't know how long I stayed there, lost in a haze of pain and despair, my mind fraying at the edges. I was shackled and herded like cattle, the once wild fire inside me reduced to ashes. And then I saw her, my sister, hanging upside down, blood streaming from her throat. Her eyes were open, wide with terror as she gasped for breath, her life slipping away before me. I screamed, but my cries were swallowed by the oppressive darkness, my voice just another lost echo in the endless horror around us. In that moment I realized that we were nothing to these people, mere animals, meat for them to carve and consume. As the life drained from my sister's eyes, I understood that there was no escape, no mercy. We were doomed to suffer and die in this God-forsaken place. The innkeeper's warning played over in my head, a bitter reminder of how foolish I'd been to dismiss it. They say true horror is born from regret, from the knowledge that things could have been different. And as I stood shackled in filth and despair, watching my sister's last breath, I knew I'd carry this horror with me for as long as I remained in this pit of suffering, haunted by the memory of everything I'd lost.